right, so today we're gonna talk about boundaries. I got a request to talk about boundaries and, in particular, what it's like to set boundaries and dealing with the anxiety that comes around that. And in actual fact, I think a lot of our anxiety comes around not being able to set boundaries and feeling the fallout of that. And I want to preface that this is probably one of the most challenging areas for me personally. So I'm not sure how great of a teacher that I'll be, but do my best here. There's a lot of dynamics that are going on when we work on setting boundaries or when we feel like we need to set boundaries. What does it mean to, one, even have boundaries? And then two, what does it mean to actually set boundaries? Let's just look at the different dimensions of boundaries themselves. There's physical boundaries, which involve personal space, right? Physical touch, something that my kids are learning about right now. So not to crawl all over me all the time. I need my personal space. Please don't violate my personal space and lick me in my face and things like that. So these are things like, all right, how close can you be to someone, right? And there's a lot, and obviously in intimate relationships too, that's important. So that's one kind of boundary. Another kind of boundary that's a little less concrete is emotional boundaries, right? So emotional boundaries are there to help you protect your emotional well-being. So they actually help you to sustain or establish a sense of self, having distinction between someone else's feelings versus your own feelings. That might seem simple at first, but we'll see when we start talking about relationship templates that is actually not so simple. And another big thing for emotional boundaries is that there's a validation of your emotions. So we'll talk about why we might disregard our emotions in a kind of relationship template and how we default into relating to other people. Another kind of boundary is boundaries around time, right? So this is how you manage your time, ensuring that your time is valued, that you have enough time for yourself and your priorities. So a lot of us, we've talked about people pleasing, we've talked about avoidance. Those are difficult areas that relate to not being able to set boundaries around time. There's also mental boundaries. This is the last category, is boundaries that protect your thoughts or your mental health, allowing you to maintain a healthy balance or healthy structure, being able to have a sense of self to be able to engage and operate and function in the world in a healthy way. We need boundaries. I'm just bringing these up because we can look at the different areas that this comes where you have difficulty and start to just explore the dynamics of why that is. Why do I have difficulty setting emotional boundaries versus physical boundaries, or really any kind of boundary, right? So we're going to talk about why setting boundaries can be challenging. And what I want to do is look at this through the lens of the relationship template. And what I mean by relationship template is a kind of very basic, think of it as like the DNA or the very core program of how we've learned to relate to another person. I think I've talked about this in some groups early on, but this develops really early in our child development, right? So this is by the time we're 16 months, we have the initial basic relationship template of how we relate to another person. And the primary relationship template that we normally have is with our moms. It's just generally the first, whoever your primary caregiver was, but the mom is usually the first one. If you want to geek out on this, you can look at object relations theory in any sort of like psychodynamics and psychology. And there's a lot of psychotherapy is based off of this theory called object relations. There's been a lot of research done on it, but it helps us understand how our early relationships influence our current way of relating to others. Okay. So when we're talking about anxiety, actually, a lot of times the anxiety comes in as a felt tone in that relationship itself. There's anxiety in the underlying dynamics that kick in with this template. We'll talk about this in a little bit too, but let's just call object relations, though, to give you a little background on object relations theory. So the definition here that I have is it suggests that our early experiences with primary caregivers shape how we relate to others throughout our lives. So these early relationships form internalized quote unquote objects, which are mental representations of ourselves and others. So it's the way that we view ourselves and then the way that we view others. And this influences our expectations and interactions in adulthood. So when it comes to both setting boundaries and anxiety, if we're looking at it through this lens, it's really quite profound, actually. You guys have probably heard about secure attachment versus insecure attachment. So, secure attachment is when we experienced consistent and nurturing care. So, for those of you who have heard me give talks on this before, it's like the holding environment for the relationship template with this other person and with yourself is very consistent, it's nurturing, and it's supportive. And it's the foundation of all the other experiences that we have with other people. It's like the DNA, the blueprint, let's say. So when we have a basic trust in this, like the way that I'm relating to me and the way that I'm relating to you, I have a basic trust that's going to go well. It's not going to fall apart. Then the feeling tone of the relationship template is, let's say, very relaxed, right? I can trust it. I don't have to effort or struggle or be fearful or anxious that it's going to fall apart. So insecure attachment, on the other hand, is if that holding environment or if our caregivers were more inconsistent, maybe they were more absent, they weren't quite as attuned, they could have been more neglectful, or they could have been more intrusive, like they were less careful, let's say. We might develop a kind of insecure attachment that comes with a feeling tone of anxiety or fear or shakiness, right? So this relationship template starts to be like, I can't trust this other person, or I have to be on guard. So if that's your basic primary way that you learned how to do, that's the blueprint that you've had, that is what kicks in any kind of relationship that you might encounter. And most of this stuff is happening in the unconscious. We're not aware that it's happening. It's so quick. And so we have expectations right away that we might not even be aware of. We might have expectations that will be rejected. We might have expectations that somebody's going to criticize us. We might have expectations that we need to be a certain way in order for the other person to be approving of us or to have the relationship be stable. So you can see how this starts to play a role in setting boundaries. Because if this blueprint is a little bit more insecure, let's say, then we will have trouble setting boundaries because there's a lot at stake. If we set boundaries and we say, oh, my time ends here, or, oh, this is how I actually feel about this, or, oh, this is like my physical space and I'm not willing to do this or that, the blueprint that you might have is that you're risking connection. You're risking the relationship falling apart. And that might not be objectively true in this current moment, but it was true back then. So this is like the whole basis of psychotherapy and psychoanalytic traditions, is like all of that stuff has an effect on how we interact and how we carry ourselves, how we view ourselves, how we relate to other people. So secure attachment versus insecure attachment. We may also have a fear of abandonment if that early relationship wasn't stable. There might be a very deep-seated fear of abandonment. You can feel the survival instinct in that. So if you have a fear that your caregiver is going to just leave, be totally gone, like the other person just disappears, the feeling is a deep dread because your survival is based on how this other person, how your primary caregiver is responding to you. And all of this is happening in the first year of life, year to year and a half of life. And then subsequent experiences get stacked on top of that. So if I have a fear of abandonment, see how risky it is to set boundaries. If I set a boundary for myself, the other person might just totally take off and leave. The conscious mind might say, it's not a big deal. I'm an adult now. I can take care of myself. But we might consciously go, oh, we had great parents. They were there for us. They loved us. Yes, that's true. Okay. But we also have to tune into what's happening in our bodies and in our experience in this moment. You see what I mean? So, a couple of other things to look at in terms of the issues with object relations or this early relationship template. We might have a negative self-concept, a negative image of ourselves that developed because the other person who we were relating to thought negatively of us or criticized us or humiliated us or emotionally abused us somehow. If we were made to feel like we were unworthy, not loved, not valuable, we might have internalized a kind of negative self-image. What comes with that negative self-image is a difficulty feeling like our boundaries even matter, right? Us having boundaries then is not important. And so this is where people pleasing can come in, difficulty saying no. We might lack a kind of self-assertion because we don't believe that we can take up space or that it's okay. This is a huge one for me. And for those, you guys probably heard my story before. Just growing up in Asian culture is a lot of you don't matter. The bigger whole, the family matters, the culture matters, the expectations matter, but you personally don't really matter. And so it's a huge thing, at least in the culture that I grew up with, is like trying to set boundaries is frowned upon almost because your expectation is to sacrifice for the whole, right? This doesn't matter what you want. It matters what the family wants. It doesn't matter what you need. It matters what the family needs, which there's positives to that. But this is like the negative side of it is that it can lead us to feeling like we don't matter in that initial blueprint. Okay, so along with that can come enmeshment or a lack of autonomy. So in some cases, caregivers might have been like gooey with us, which is totally normal. You're with a baby or something like that, and it's, oh, you just want to get in their face and like snuggle with them. They're so cute, right? Eventually, at some point in their development, they need to separate and they need to feel as they're individuating that they have a physical body that is very individual and they start to have individual experiences that are separate from their primary caregivers. But toddlers have a big no. This is where they're starting to set boundaries. They're starting to set their initial sense of self. And then the parents might go, that doesn't matter, right? Or they're all up in their face or they start to get enmeshed. So it blurs the line between our own needs and what other people need. And it makes it difficult, again, to assert our own boundaries because this is another thing that we might feel responsible for the other person's boundaries. You might go, if I get sad, then the other person's going to get sad. Or if you see this other person get depressed, then it's going to have some impact on you. And then you feel like I have to take care of it or change things on the outside. So you see there's a lack of autonomy. So that creates a kind of anxiety when we have a lack of autonomy, a lack of a sense of ourselves and a sense of the other person of they're okay, they're separate, they have their own experience, and I'm okay. I have my own experience, and it doesn't have to be so enmeshed. That's a very complex and tricky territory, but we're just giving the overview here. So that can lead to guilt and obligation, right? We talk about people pleasing, having conditional, let's say, approval from the other person, or that we have to manipulate ourselves somehow to make the other person feel okay and for the relationship template in this blueprint to be okay.